So read, stuck on the block, read, sitting in the box, read.
Yo, what's going on, people? This is Akala, and this week's great read is Fighting the Slave Trade, West African Strategies, edited by Sylviane A. Diouf. One of the most amazing and important books ever to be written on the history of transatlantic and actually trans-Saharan, because it deals with some of the trans-Saharan slave trade as well, because it deals with the most neglected area. People are happy to tell you, if you go to school in Britain, you learn, 3 things about slavery. Wilberforce set Africans free. Britain was the first country in the world to abolish slavery, and it did so primarily for moral reasons. And Africans sold their own people, apparently, is the cliche. What this book does is really looks at and refutes much of that nonsense. Of course, no one is disputing that people that we now think of as Africans sold other people that we now think of as Africans, but there's no reason to think that's the way people viewed it at the time. Today we view, or maybe not, maybe my Irish homies would disagree with this, but people tend to view Irish and British people as both white European people. But clearly when the British invaded Ireland and treated the Irish the way they did and starved Irish people to death and developed all kinds of racist theories about the Irish, they did not see the Irish as their quote-unquote white brothers and sisters. In fact, even till the time I was growing up, the idea that the Irish were kind of inferior was still with us. So there's no reason to project modern considerations onto 17th century African kingdoms. And what Diouf and other scholars outline here is that actually even the African kingdoms that were big-time slave dealers, Ashanti, Oyo, Dahomey, generally had laws or restrictions on selling their own citizens, their own people. They took steps to protect their own citizens. Now let's be clear, that's not meant as as praise to those African kingdoms. It means they knew damn well it wasn't wrong, but they were willing, like most other polities in the world, in the whole history of the world, to do to others what they were not willing to do to their own. But to say they sold their own people is a colonial projection. They went to war with other groups of people, they raided on other groups of people, as people have throughout the world since time immemorial. But more impressively and more interestingly, there is a long tradition of what, if it was in Europe, would be called working class resistance, but because obviously, West African, medieval West African and 18th century, 17th century West African societies were not industrial in the way that Europe was. Another phrase will have to be found, but African peasants, farmers, workers, existing enslaved people, etc., rose up consistently against African slave dealers, collaborators. So one of the estimates is that 1 in every 10 European ships to dock in West Africa was attacked either on board or from land. There were guerrilla groups all up and down the West African coast that would later become Maroons in the Caribbean. It's really weird that a lot of black Americans and Caribbeans think our ancestors only started resisting the moment they landed in the Caribbean or America. It's like Africans, undifferentiated by class, region or ethnicity, all sold us into slavery, and then suddenly we started resisting when we got into the Caribbean or America. Of course, the resistance actually started in Africa itself. David Richardson, one of the scholars in here, estimates that 1 million less people, so not a small amount, went through the Middle Passage because of the resistance in Africa itself. Entire villages were set up, communities went into the jungle, which is where the stereotype of Africans living in the jungle comes from, to hide from slave raiders. And so really, to get a properly nuanced perspective and understanding, it's fine to talk about West African collaborators and slave dealers, but it is really dishonest, especially when we promote this idea that Britain was, invested in abolition for moral reasons, which is obviously nonsense. There were abolitionists in Britain, no doubt, who genuinely believed slavery was abhorrent. But the idea that that's what motivated the British government is just laughable. And so what this book looks at is really how nuanced and difficult to understand the impacts of the slave trade were from a West African perspective, but most importantly, strategies of resistance that West Africans employed to do away with the silly myth that all Africans were slave dealers and that was their only role in the issue whatsoever, and to give a much more nuanced and deeper perspective and understanding one of the most important books to be written on that history ever. This week's great read is Fighting the Slave Trade, West African Strategies, edited by Sylviane A. Diouf. Big up.
So read, stuck on the block, read, sitting in the box, read.